He thought he'd inherited nothing but a dying pumpkin farm and a worn-out dog. But when Duke started digging near an old well, a secret buried for decades began to surface, one worth $250 million and a lifetime of redemption. If you love stories of honor, loyalty, and second chances, like and subscribe for the full journey. The train exhaled a long breath of steam before falling silent on the Montana platform, its metallic groan fading into the wind. Eli Turner stepped down with a single duffel bag slung over his shoulder, government-issued desert-worn like everything else he owned. The air bit colder here, cleaner, too sharp enough to sting the back of his throat. 15 years in the Corps, 5 more trying to pretend he wasn't still at war. And now this, the end of a long road that no one asked him to walk. The truck, waiting by the curb, was as tired as the man himself. A '94 Chevy paint-peeling door handle, loose, the kind of vehicle that smelled like old sweat and gasoline. A folded will sat on the passenger seat. Eli had read it 5 times already. His grandfather's handwriting was cramped, hard to read, but one line stayed clear in his head: keep the dog. He knows more than any man. He hadn't laughed. He hadn't smiled in years. The drive took him west through dying fields, past shuttered diners and gas stations, whose neon signs still flickered out of habit. By the time he turned onto the gravel road leading home, dusk had begun its slow crawl down the sky. The farmhouse rose from the distance like an apology no one wanted to give, peeling paint, sagging porch weeds tall enough to hide the fences. He parked near the gate. The chain was rusted shut, padlock eaten by weather. He broke it with the handle of a wrench. As he stepped inside, the wind carried the scent of dust rot and something faintly sweet, pumpkin flesh long gone to decay. Then came the bark. Deep, controlled, not angry, but commanding. Eli froze. From the porch, a German shepherd stepped forward, coat the color of autumn wheat, streaked with black muzzle gray with age. The dog's stance was steady, almost military. Its eyes, amber intelligent, never left Eli's. "You must be Duke," Eli murmured. The name felt foreign on his tongue. The dog tilted his head, studying him with unnerving patience, as though comparing him to a memory. Inside the house carried the smell of years left untouched. Dust floated in the thin light, seeping through half-drawn curtains. Furniture stood like ghosts under white sheets. Eli found the kitchen, ran the tap, and waited until brown water turned clear. He filled a cracked bowl for the dog. Duke drank quietly, glancing up between gulps as if still deciding whether to trust him. Eli leaned against the counter, his reflection caught in the window, hard jaw, hollow eyes, the look of a man who'd spent too long fighting things that didn't bleed. Later in the bedroom upstairs, he unpacked a single photograph, his wife Sarah standing in sunlight, smiling the way only people who believe in futures can smile. That was before the fire, before the long silence that followed. He placed the photo on the nightstand next to the will. The line echoed again, "Keep the dog." Downstairs, Duke paced near the back door, restless. Eli watched him from the stairs, arms folded. "You miss him, huh? The old man." Duke stopped, looked up, and for a strange moment Eli thought the dog understood. Maybe he did. Maybe grief wasn't something humans owned alone. Outside, the sky bruised purple, the wind picking up, carrying whispers through the hollow fields. Eli lit the single working lamp, sat at the kitchen table, and opened a beer gone warm. He read through the rest of the will, most of it plain legalese, except one odd note scribbled in the margin. "Check the old shed before first frost." He frowned. The shed was still there. He remembered leaning behind the orchard, half swallowed by vines. He'd go in the morning. Tonight, he needed to breathe. When the clock struck midnight, Duke lifted his head suddenly and barked once toward the window, low and sharp. Eli turned. Nothing but darkness outside. "Easy," he muttered, but the unease stayed. The dog didn't bark again, only stared out into the orchard tail's stiff body tense. Eli followed his gaze. Beyond the dying pumpkins, the wind moved differently there, like it had shape, like something unseen was passing through. He couldn't explain why, but the hair on his arms rose. He shut the curtains, locked the door, and stood in the kitchen listening to the old wood creak under the weight of silence. He'd been in firefights quieter than this. Before heading upstairs, he looked back once more at Duke. The dog was lying down now, eyes half closed, but one ear still pricked toward the dark window. A sentry off duty, but never at rest. Eli exhaled, rubbed his face, and whispered, "What the hell did he mean, you know more than any man?" The house didn't answer. Outside, the moon rose over the fields, pale and cold, lighting the orchard in shades of silver. Somewhere in that sea of dying vines and forgotten pumpkins, a secret waited patient as the old dog keeping watch. Morning came late on the Turner farm. The light that spilled across the fields didn't warm anything. It only exposed the ruin. The pumpkins were mostly gone the farm, breathing like something barely alive. Eli stopped near the barn, stared at the faded red paint peeling in wide curls. He could still hear the echo of his grandfather's voice, though he barely remembered the man. Just fragment stories told over static phone calls when he was a boy. The house behind him creaked as the wind rolled through. Inside, papers still lay spread across the kitchen table from the night before. The will, the property deed, a handful of unpaid bills. He had been meaning to call the bank about restructuring the loan, at least until he noticed the envelope already stamped "Final Notice." He'd opened it that morning, expecting another warning. Instead, what he found chilled him: a deferment request approved and signed 3 weeks ago, with his name in handwriting that wasn't his. He studied the signature for 10 minutes straight, tracing the loops the shape of the letters. Someone had signed for him. Someone had paused the foreclosure while he was still in Texas. But why, and who even knew enough to do it? He picked up the phone and dialed the number on the letter. A woman answered, polite, careful, the kind of tone people use when they expect anger. When he asked about the deferment, there was a pause too long. "Our records show it was authorized," she said, "by the primary account holder." He told her he hadn't even been in the state. The silence that followed was heavier than words. She promised to look into it and call him back. She never did. By afternoon, the air thickened with the scent of rain. Eli spent the next hours mending a section of fence more out of habit than hope. Duke lay in the dirt nearby, watching the tree line, his ears flicking toward every small sound. When the rumble of an approaching engine broke the stillness, the dog stood, muscles tense. A silver SUV rolled up the drive, too new, too polished for this forgotten patch of land. A man stepped out, well-dressed hair, combed shoes unsuited for mud. He smiled, like someone used to getting what he wanted. "Mr. Turner," he asked. "I'm Mark Leary, local real estate. Heard you might be considering selling." Eli wiped his hands on his jeans, frowning. "I'm not." The man's smile didn't waver. "Everything's for sale, especially places like this. Hard to keep a property this size going alone. I could make you a very generous offer." Duke growled low, a steady vibration in his throat. Eli rested a hand on the dog's head. "You've been out here before?" he asked. Leary hesitated. "I make rounds, just keeping an eye on what's available." The lie was too casual. His shoes were clean, but the SUV's tires carried fresh mud the same shade as the field behind the barn. "Not interested," Eli said flatly. The man gave a small nod, left a card on the porch rail, and drove off, wheels spitting gravel. Duke didn't move until the car vanished down the road. That night, the wind brought rain. Eli sat at the kitchen table, the card lying beside his beer. Leary and Associates Agricultural Property Management. He flipped it over. No address, just a phone number. Duke lay near the door, eyes fixed on the dark window. When thunder rolled across the hills, he didn't flinch, but the moment headlights flashed briefly in the distance, he growled a deep warning sound that made Eli's skin prickle. He went to the window. Nothing there, just the orchard, swaying under the rain. But Duke wouldn't settle. The dog paced nails, clicking against the floorboards, body taut with unease. Eli sighed, pulled on his jacket, and grabbed a flashlight. "All right, show me," he muttered. Duke bolted through the door into the wet night, his bark echoing through the hollow fields. Eli followed, boots sinking into the mudlight, cutting across vines bent under the storm. The dog led him past the barn to the pumpkin shed, half collapsed, its roof sagging like a tired shoulder. Duke stopped there, paws digging into the muck, barking toward the ground. Eli swung the flashlight and froze. Two deep tire tracks ran through the mud, leading right up to the shed and ending abruptly where the earth had caved slightly. The tracks were fresh, the rain hadn't washed them out yet. Someone had been here, and not long ago. He crouched, pressing a palm to the wet soil, the impression still firm edges crisp. Heavy vehicle, maybe a truck. His heartbeat slowed into that old rhythm he'd learned overseas focus, measure, act. Duke circled the spot, sniffing, then barked once, sharp, and sure like confirmation. Eli stood, scanned the darkness, the orchard stretching endless around him. The rain eased into mist, quieting everything except the rasp of Duke's breathing and the distant hum of something unseen. "Who's coming out here?" Eli whispered. The dog looked up, amber eyes glinting under the weak beam of light, and Eli realized the question wasn't just about who. It was about why. The morning after the rain smelled of wet soil and iron. Eli woke to Duke pacing the floorboards again, restless ears twitching toward the back of the house. The air carried that heavy silence that only follows a storm, a silence that felt expectant. When Eli opened the door, the fields shimmered under a low fog, rows of decayed vines glistening like veins under skin. The world felt paused, waiting. He poured coffee, still thinking about the tire tracks, the forged signature, the man in the SUV. Questions stacked on one another, too many for one morning. The dog stood near the corner, tail straight, pawing at the ground where the soil had been churned. "What now?" Eli muttered, walking over. Duke kept digging dirt, flying claws, scraping wood and stone until something pale showed through the mud. Eli crouched beside him, brushing away clumps of soil. A piece of plastic peeked out, a folded sealed bag yellowed by age. Inside was a scrap of paper edges, torn writing still legible despite the years. He peeled the plastic open carefully. The handwriting was familiar. Tight, disciplined strokes, the kind his grandfather used on the old tax ledgers in the attic. Section 7A, under the well. Eli turned it over, but the back was blank. No map, no directions. Just those words, simple and unsettling. "What well?" he murmured. The only one he remembered was the dry one, at the edge of the orchard, covered years ago with rotting boards. Duke sat back on his haunches, watching him, ears twitching as though waiting for the next command. Eli rubbed the mud off his palms, his heart beating harder than it should. He'd buried too many things in his life, now something buried was calling back. He spent the next hour in the house searching through old drawers, boxes, anything that might explain what Section 7A meant. The old property plans were missing. So were half the financial papers from the year before his grandfather's death. But one thing did stand out. A letter from the local bank manager dated 15 years ago congratulating Grant Turner for renewing an agricultural trust. Eli remembered the name, the same man who'd sent him the foreclosure notice. By noon, he drove into town. The bank sat in the middle of Main Street, a small brick building that hadn't changed in decades. Inside, the scent of polished wood and old carpet hit him like memory. A receptionist greeted him with that small-town politeness that barely hid curiosity. "Mr. Turner, right. He'll see you now." The manager's office was dim-lined with photos, Eli's grandfather and most of them shaking hands, smiling like a man who had secrets to keep. Eli, the manager, said, rising with a practiced smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Been a long time." Eli nodded. "Found something on the property. Thought maybe you could help me make sense of it." He unfolded the note and placed it on the desk. The man leaned forward, the smile faltering almost instantly. His fingers hesitated before touching the paper like it might burn. "Where did you get this?" "In the woodshed. Dog dug it up this morning." The manager's eyes flicked to Eli's face, then down again to the words. "That's your grandfather's handwriting." "I know." A pause. The clock on the wall ticked too loudly. "You shouldn't have brought this here," the man said finally. Eli frowned. "Why not? It's just a piece of paper." The manager shook his head. "No, it isn't. Section 7A isn't on your deed. It was sealed. That part of the property was transferred out years ago. Transferred to Garrity Agricultural Holdings, LLC under a sealed custodial trust with access restricted by a court order dated 1990. Transferred to who? He exhaled, slowly, choosing his words. I can't tell you that. What I can tell you is that you should leave that section alone. The well's been condemned for decades. Don't go digging around there. Eli leaned back, studying the man. You used to fish with my grandfather every summer. Now you're telling me not to walk my own land. The manager looked away, jaw tightening. I'm telling you that not everything he did was meant to be found. Something cold settled in Eli's chest. Then what did he want me to find? For the first time, the manager's voice dropped almost to a whisper. Nothing. If you're smart, you'll sell. Take the offer when it comes. What offer? For the man had already stood signaling the end of the conversation. I have work to do, Eli, please. Go home. Outside, the sun had slipped behind a wall of gray. Eli sat in the truck for a long moment, staring at the note in his hand. Section 7A, under the well. The words felt heavier now, like coordinates to something no one wanted found. Duke was waiting by the passenger door, eyes bright head tilted as if asking whether they were heading home or somewhere deeper. Eli looked down at the paper again, his grandfather's handwriting running steady across the page. The well. The condemned part of the land. The manager's fear. Every instinct told him to drop it. But every inch of him, the soldier, the grandson, the man who'd already lost too much, told him he couldn't. He folded the note, slipped it into his pocket, and started the engine. The road back stretched empty under the clouds, the kind of silence that warned before it spoke. By the time Eli got back from town, the clouds had thickened into a low, colorless ceiling. The kind that pressed on your shoulders until you felt smaller. The wind pushed across the pumpkin fields, carrying the smell of rust and old rain. Duke was waiting by the porch steps, tail-thumping once before he turned and started walking toward the far side of the property. Eli followed without a word, the map in his pocket like a pulse he couldn't quiet. They passed the barn, the fence line, the patches of dirt where the pumpkins had withered into soft husks. The land felt hollow, like it had been listening too long. At the edge of the field, Duke stopped and began to dig at a patch of ground where the weeds grew thicker. Eli knelt, brushing aside the brush. There, half hidden under a mat of vines, was a circular slab of concrete, cracked and sunken. The remnants of an old well cover. He crouched closer, tracing the seam with his fingers. The concrete wasn't poured all at once, it had been patched. Layers over layers. A seal, not a repair. Section 7. Eli whispered, his breath fogging the air. Duke's nails scratched against the edge claws, clicking over the surface as if trying to find a weak spot. Eli retrieved a crowbar from the truck, wedged it under one of the cracks, and leaned his weight into it. The sound was deep metallic, a muffled ring that didn't belong in concrete. He froze. No hollow echo, no sound of water below, just a dull thud like hitting metal buried under stone. He drove the crowbar again, chipping away at the edges until gray dust coated his hands. The slab gave, slightly revealing a plate beneath it, a sheet of steel corroded but intact, welded in place by hand. Someone had gone through a lot of effort to keep this closed. Duke backed away, pacing in tight circles, ears flattened, growling low at nothing. Eli pressed a hand against the steel, feeling its chill. Whoever had sealed this hadn't wanted it to be found. But someone else, his grandfather, had left a note telling him where to look. He fetched a hammer and chisel from the shed, worked at the weld until sweat ran down his neck despite the cold. When the first seam cracked, a faint smell of oil and earth rose up, old and sour. He worked faster. Hours passed unnoticed until the final edge gave with a metallic snap. The plate shifted heavy but loose enough to pry open. The space below was small, a cavity barely large enough for a person to crouch inside. He shone the flashlight in. The beam hit a metal safe no larger than a toolbox streaked with rust. His pulse quickened. "You see in this, Duke?" he whispered. The dog didn't bark, only watched from the edge chest, heaving. Eli lowered himself down carefully, boots scraping against the stone. The air was damp, the walls lined with cold concrete. He dragged the safe out, set it on the ground, and studied the lock. It was already broken. Someone had opened this before. His stomach tightened. He lifted the lid. The hinges groaned, echoing softly inside the cavity. The interior was mostly empty except for dust and the faint smell of metal. Whoever came here stripped paper and metal, but dismissed the dog tag as a keepsake, never guessing it carried a hidden payload. At the bottom, a single object rested against the steel base. A military ID tag, rusted and worn, the chain tangled around itself. Eli picked it up, brushed away the dirt, and read the engraving, Lieutenant Frank D. Weller, U.S. Army, 1989. He frowned. The name meant nothing to him. He turned the tag over, no message, no connection to his grandfather, but the date pulled at something in the back of his mind. 1989. The same year his grandfather had suddenly sold half the farm's equipment, the same year the tax records went blank for 6 months. He remembered hearing his father mention it once in passing, something about a debt the old man could never explain. Now there was this. A name, a rank, a year. Duke whined softly, the sound bouncing off the well walls. Eli looked up at the horizon. The sky had turned dark again, the light bleeding out of the world. He tucked the tag into his pocket, climbed out and sat on the cold ground beside Duke. "Missing soldier," he murmured. "What were you doing under my land?" The dog pressed against his leg, eyes fixed on the open hole as though waiting for something else to rise. But nothing moved. No wind, no sound. Just the quiet hum of the earth and the faint rattle of the loosened steel plate swaying slightly in the breeze. Eli stared down into the darkness below, his thoughts running circles around the same question: what could tie a missing soldier to his grandfather, a man who never left Montana? The farm stretched around them, gray and endless, and somewhere beneath the soil the past began to shift. The next morning broke in dull gray streaks that turned the fields into silver mist. Eli couldn't sleep. The ID tag lay on the kitchen table, still flecked with rust. He had cleaned it, not to make it new, but to make it legible. Frank D. Weller, 1989. The name looped in his mind like a forgotten tune. He opened his laptop, the one that still smelled faintly of ash from the apartment fire years ago, and logged into the Veterans Registry. The site loaded slowly, its design old-fashioned government standard. He typed the name carefully, hand shaking slightly from caffeine and lack of rest. It took a moment before the result appeared: Lieutenant Frank Daniel Weller, 3rd Corps Engineering Division. Retired deceased presumed MIA, 1989 Civilian Integration Project 7A. Eli froze. Project 7A. The words hit him like cold water. The same label written on the note Duke had unearthed, Section 7A, under the well. He scrolled further, reading the attached summary: Civilian Infrastructure Redeployment Initiative. Classified Agricultural Subsidy Program, Montana Post-Conflict Reconstruction Funding. The phrasing meant little on the surface, but Eli had seen that kind of bureaucratic camouflage before. In the service, it meant something else entirely, a project that didn't want to exist. He clicked the Associated Personnel tab. His grandfather's name appeared 3 entries down: Grant Turner Contractor Accounting Oversight. His pulse quickened. His grandfather hadn't been just a farmer. He had worked for the same project the same year the lieutenant disappeared. Eli leaned back, the chair creaking under his weight, a quiet ache building behind his eyes. He had grown up thinking his grandfather measured worth by soil and yield. Not numbers on a ledger or coordinates on a map, but maybe the pumpkins had only been a disguise. He searched again, cross-referencing the project name with other files. A handful of articles surfaced, mostly declassified reports stripped of meaning. The funding had come through private logistics firms contracted by the Department of Agriculture. One name appeared again and again: Garrity Logistics. He whispered it out loud. It sounded distant, almost harmless, until he remembered where he had seen it before. He reached for the worn leather wallet on the counter, flipping through the photographs inside until he found one Sarah standing in front of an office sign in Dallas. Garrity Logistics Regional Accounting Division. His throat tightened. She had worked there for 5 years until the fire. The one the investigators said started in faulty wiring. He had never questioned it, never wanted to. Now, he wasn't sure he could avoid it. He opened his email. archives old messages she'd sent before they drifted apart. Most were mundane bills, reminders recipes, but one caught his eye. The subject line read, "Strange transfer notice. Remind me to ask you about it." The message was short. "Weird numbers in the client reports today. Someone's funneling old government accounts through dormant agricultural trusts. I'll explain when you're home." She'd sent it 2 days before the fire. Eli sat back, staring at the screen, the cursor blinking beside her words. The room felt smaller. Duke, lying near the door, lifted his head and watched him quietly. "You knew something," Eli whispered, his voice catching, "didn't you?" He stood pacing his boots, thudding softly against the worn floor. The connection between his grandfather, the missing soldier, and his wife tightened like wire. It wasn't just coincidence, it couldn't be. Garrity Logistics had financed Project 7A, the same one his grandfather had worked on, the same one where a soldier had vanished and somehow ended up beneath his land. Sarah had stumbled onto something, and maybe that was why she never had the chance to tell him. He rubbed his hands together, the old scars along his knuckles whitening. "What were you trying to tell me?" The wind outside rattled the loose window pane. He looked over at the pumpkin field through the glass, the same land his grandfather had spent a lifetime protecting, the same land someone had tried to buy for far more than it was worth. Every line now connected back to that ground that well. Duke stood suddenly, ears pricking, tail stiff. The dog moved toward the door, barking once, low and deliberate. Eli followed, stepping onto the porch. The horizon shimmered with heat, though the air was cold. In the distance, a black SUV sat idling by the road before slowly backing away and disappearing behind the tree line. He didn't need to see the license plate to know it wasn't the first time they'd come. He clenched the dog's collar gently. "They're watching," he said under his breath. Duke growled, eyes fixed on the retreating dust. Inside the laptop screen dimmed Sarah's last email, still open, the words faint but unignorable. Dormant agricultural trusts. The same phrasing from the old project files. Eli's mind moved fast, connecting names, places, years. His grandfather's work, the soldier's disappearance, the corporate shell his wife worked for, it all converged, here on this piece of dying land. And whatever had started under Project 7A had never truly ended. The day Linda Garrity arrived, the sun came out for the first time in weeks, washing the farm in light that made the decay almost look beautiful. Eli had been mending the fence when he heard the sound of tires crunching gravel. He turned to see a silver Range Rover glide up the drive, too clean, too foreign for the dirt road it traveled. A woman stepped out, late 20s, maybe 30, with the kind of poise that came from generations of never having to explain herself. She wore a charcoal coat, her blonde hair swept neatly over one shoulder, and when she smiled, it was the kind that practiced empathy without ever feeling it. "Mr. Turner," she called, her voice calm, rehearsed. "I hope I'm not intruding." Eli wiped his hands on his jeans, wary. "That depends who's asking." "Linda Garrity," she said, extending her hand. "My father used to own Garrity Logistics. If this becomes public the way you're steering it, the civil exposure could bury thousands of pensions tied to legacy Garrity bonds, including people who never chose any of this." Eli didn't take her hand. He'd read that name too many times in his wife's files, his grandfather's documents, and the soldier's report. "Used to?" he asked. She smiled faintly. "Let's say the company has changed form. We're pursuing legacy assets. This property came up in our audit." Eli crossed his arms. "Funny, you're about the fourth person to show up this month saying the same thing. I'm not like them," she said softly. "I came to offer you something real." She gestured toward the car where a leather briefcase sat open on the seat. Inside was a neat stack of papers beside a small black case that could only mean one thing: money. $10 million, she said. "Cash, no delays, no conditions. You sign today, and this place is off your hands forever." When Eli asked why the foreclosure had been deferred with his forged signature, Linda didn't deny it. She said their auditors kept the asset from going to auction until a proper transfer could be arranged. The number hit him like a gust of heat. It was more money than he'd ever seen, enough to erase his debts, rebuild his life, maybe even escape the weight of every unanswered question. But the way she set off your hands sounded like a warning, not a gift. He studied her face. Why this land, he asked. It's worthless. The soil's dead, the irrigation's gone. You could buy 1,000 better acres for half that price. Linda's smile held. Some things aren't about yield, they're about location. Her words hung in the air heavy with double meaning. And what's under it? Eli asked. Her expression didn't flicker, but her fingers tightened slightly around the handle of her bag. Mr. Turner, she said quietly, I'm giving you a way out. You don't want the attention this property will bring. You've already been through enough. The mention of his past made him step closer, anger rising despite his restraint. You don't know anything about what I've been through. I know your wife worked for my father. She said, her tone still even. And I know what she found before she died. The silence that followed felt like it could split the air. Eli's heart pounded, his breath sharp. You need to leave, he said, voice low, now. Linda studied him for a moment, something almost like pity crossing her eyes. Think about it, she said softly. 10 million. Tomorrow I won't be able to make the same offer. She turned and walked back to her car, her heels crunching gravel in slow, deliberate rhythm. The engine started, the tires spun dust, and then she was gone. The sound lingered long after the car disappeared down the road. Duke appeared beside him, having watched the entire exchange from the porch. Ears pricked, muscles tense. Eli knelt and scratched behind his ear. They're getting bolder, he muttered. The dog's gaze never left the road. That night the wind came back. It pressed against the windows, rattled the loose shingles. Eli sat at the kitchen table, the note, the ID, and Sarah's last email spread out before him like puzzle pieces. $10 million for silence. He could have taken it, walked away, pretended none of this existed. But the truth had already rooted too deep. Duke lay by the back door, restless tail twitching even in his sleep. Around midnight, he shot up barking, once sharp and urgent, then sprinted outside. Eli followed, grabbing the flashlight. The beam cut through the dark in trembling lines as Duke led him into the fields. The soil was slick from evening dew, his boots sinking into mud as he tried to keep pace. The dog stopped near the edge of the pumpkin patch, growling low. Eli shone the light forward. Something metallic glimmered against the dirt. A small drone, its rotor bent, the body cracked from impact. He crouched beside it, brushing off the mud. The casing was matte black, unmarked, except for a small red light that blinked faintly before dying. He turned it over and froze. The underside held a thermal camera module, its lens still warm. A secondary bay housed a compact LiDAR and a magnetometer package enough to map shallow subsurface shapes and metal seams from above. The direction of its tilt faced the orchard and the exact spot of the old well. Eli's stomach tightened. They hadn't just been watching him. They'd been tracking the land, mapping heat signatures, maybe even searching for something buried deeper. Duke circled barking once more before going silent, his eyes fixed on the dark line of trees beyond the well. Eli picked up the drone, the quiet whir of its cooling fan the only sound between them. Somewhere, far off, an engine hummed faint, but deliberate, like someone waiting for confirmation. He killed his flashlight and crouched beside the dog, watching the horizon through the dark. The drone's light blinked once more, then died completely. The storm rolled in before dawn, turning the air thick with the smell of soil and static. Eli hadn't slept. The drone lay disassembled on the kitchen table, its camera removed, its data chip already fried. Whoever sent it hadn't meant to lose it. He sat across from it with a mug of cold coffee, his fingers tapping against the wood, his mind replaying every thread that tied his life to this land. His grandfather, the missing soldier, the project, Sarah. Duke sat by the fireplace, head resting on his paws, eyes open alert. Outside, rain began to fall slow and steady, tapping against the windows like a reminder. Eli stood restless, pacing the floor. Something about Linda Garrity's words wouldn't leave him. You don't want the attention this property will bring. He glanced toward the staircase. The old farmhouse had been rebuilt twice, once after a fire in the 1950s and again after a windstorm in the 70s. His grandfather had done the second renovation himself. The west wall of the living room still bore faint seams where plaster met older wood. If he had wanted to hide something, that's where it would be. Eli fetched a hammer and began prying loose the paneling. Dust fell in soft clouds, filling the air with the smell of cedar and thyme. The boards gave after a few hits, revealing insulation yellowed with age, and behind it a narrow hollow lined with newspaper from 1974. He reached inside and felt something solid. When he pulled it out, he found a small leather-bound book edges, cracked pages swollen from years of moisture. The initials embossed on the front read, G.T. his grandfather's. He sat down on the floor, heart pounding, and opened it carefully. The handwriting was meticulous numbers arranged in neat columns, each entry dated between 1949 and 1952. The descriptions were brief, clinical. Shipment received, $42,000. Transfer via Harvest Channel, confirm receipt. Hold for redistribution, local storage. Over and over, the same phrases appeared all under the same header, Operation Harvest. Eli flipped through page after page, the amounts growing larger, the handwriting tighter. Some entries were marked with symbols, triangles, circles, lines, notations he didn't recognize. It wasn't a farmer's ledger. It was a record of movement money, possibly smuggled or hidden. Operation Harvest. He whispered, his thumb tracing the ink. It wasn't part of Project 7A, at least not officially. Maybe it had been the hidden arm of it, the part too sensitive to document. Rain pounded harder against the windows, thunder rolling in the distance. Duke lifted his head ears, twitching. Eli turned to the back of the book, hoping for an explanation. The last few pages were different, fewer numbers, more words. Short notes written in a more hurried hand. Funds secured off-site. Swiss channels confirmed. Final consolidation under yield account. His heart thudded faster. On the very last page, one sentence stood alone, underlined twice. Pumpkin Fields stay in family until harvest complete. Eli stared at it, the meaning slipping just out of reach. He set the ledger on the floor and rubbed his eyes, exhaustion pressing in. Duke padded over and sat beside him, nudging his knee with his muzzle. Guess he didn't trust banks, huh? Eli said softly. The dog placed a paw on the open page, smearing a bit of damp ink. Eli chuckled weakly, pulling the book back, and froze. The pressure from Duke's paw had shifted the corner of the page, lifting a thin edge of paper that shouldn't have been there. A double layer. Carefully, Eli peeled it apart. The hidden sheet was smaller, a translucent insert sealed with adhesive that had long since dried. On it, faint but legible, were rows of typed characters, numbers, and letters arranged in a familiar pattern. Coordinates, bank routing codes. At the bottom, in his grandfather's old typewriter font, the words read, Pumpkin Yield Account, Zurich, Custodial, $250, 0000000. The zeros blurred as Eli's breath caught. $250 million. Not seed money, not subsidy. Hidden assets. The handwriting in the margin confirmed it. For return when right hands reclaim. He leaned back against the wall, the thunder outside now a steady growl. His grandfather had hidden $250 million and buried the trail beneath decades of decay. Operation Harvest wasn't about farming at all. It was about collecting and safeguarding funds. But for whom Duke shifted closer, pressing his weight against Eli's leg. The dog's steady presence kept him anchored as his thoughts spiraled. The coordinates pointed to Switzerland, the banking capital for off-ledger government transfers during the post-war years. Garrity Logistics had been one of the middlemen. That meant the Garritys, and by extension, Linda knew exactly what this land was sitting on. Eli turned the page again, searching for more, but the ledger ended there. Just one final line scribbled faintly in pencil. If harvest fails, the seeds remain. He stared at the words, trying to decipher whether it was metaphor or warning. The storm outside deepened, lightning flashing across the horizon. In the brief illumination, Eli saw Duke's reflection in the window, eyes glowing, faintly fixed on the orchard beyond. The dog gave a low growl, not of fear, but recognition, as if sensing movement out there in the dark. Eli closed the ledger slowly, his pulse quickening again. The wind howled through the cracks of the old house, carrying the sound of something else metal scraping faintly against stone near the direction of the well. The knock came just after noon, sharp and deliberate, the kind that expected compliance. Eli had been sitting at the table with the ledger open in front of him, the Swiss coordinates burned into his mind. The storm had passed, leaving the fields drenched and silent. Duke's head shot up before the second knock came. He growled low and guttural. Eli set the ledger aside, wiped his palms on his jeans, and went to the door. Standing there, framed against the washed-out sky, was a different man, mid-40s, measured gaze, and a posture that read government rather than sales. But this time he wasn't smiling. His tailored suit was the same, but there was a badge clipped to his belt now, half visible beneath his jacket. "Mr. Turner," he said evenly, "we need to talk." Eli didn't move. "You here to make another offer?" The man shook his head. "Not quite. I'm Agent Paul Henning, Department of Defense Inspector General's office. Mark Leary is not one of us. He's tied to parties who want this land for reasons that won't survive daylight. I've been investigating residual accounts from Operation Harvest. You might have heard of it." Eli felt his stomach tighten, but his voice stayed calm. "You mean my grandfather's work?" Among other things, Henning said, stepping past him before Eli could object. "You inherited more than land, Mr. Turner. You inherited classified materials that should have been surrendered decades ago." He set a manila folder on the table, flipping it open to reveal photocopied documents, some of the very ledger entries Eli had just been reading. "How did you get these?" Eli asked quietly. "From our archives," Henning said. "What I don't have are the originals, which, according to our intelligence, are in your possession." Eli looked down at the ledger, now half covered by the folder. "You think this is stolen?" "I think your grandfather was part of a laundering chain," Henning replied. "Post-war surplus diverted into civilian accounts under a project labeled Operation Harvest. Funds never reported to Congress. That ledger, and whatever data accompanies it, could expose classified military logistics. You're sitting on federal evidence." His words came out measured but cold. "You're mistaken," Eli said. "He wasn't stealing anything. He was tracking it." Henning's gaze didn't soften. "Everyone says that until the numbers stop adding up. You don't understand how dangerous what you're holding is. There are still people alive who'd kill to make sure this never surfaces." Eli folded his arms. "People like the Garrity's." Henning's jaw tensed, a muscle ticking along his cheek. "You've spoken to them," he said flatly. "Then you're already compromised." Before Eli could respond, Duke barked a sharp, urgent sound from the corner of the room. Both men turned. The dog was pawing at the old metal box that had once held the military ID nose pressed to the rusted edge. "What's he doing?" Henning asked. Eli crouched beside Duke and lifted the tag. The chain clinked softly as he turned it over, noticing something he hadn't before. The back wasn't smooth, it bulged slightly near the top where corrosion had eaten away a layer of steel. He tapped it against the table. It rang hollow. "It's not just a tag," Eli murmured. He fetched a small screwdriver and pried gently at the edge. The thin backplate popped open, revealing a small metallic shard no larger than a coin, a sealed military EEPROM module, potted and coated against age. Henning's composure cracked for the first time. "Where did you get that?" he demanded. "From the well," Eli said. "Next to the safe you didn't find." Duke growled again, his body rigid between them. Henning raised a hand, palms open. "Mr. Turner, you don't know what's on that device." "You're right," Eli said, handing it to Henning, who connected a rugged field reader to the laptop and slotted the module into the reader's port. The screen flickered, then filled with a list of encrypted files. He entered the few numbers from the ledger. The code matched instantly. Dozens of folders opened, each labeled with dry, bureaucratic precision audit logs, private correspondence, disbursement ledgers. And then one folder stood out. Internal Complaint, GT. He clicked it. A scanned document appeared, dated August 3, 1989. Filed by Grant Turner. Subject: unauthorized diversion of defense assets to private accounts via Garrity Logistics. Eli's breath caught. His grandfather had filed an internal whistleblower report directly to the Department of Defense. He scrolled further. The follow-up note chilled him. Investigation terminated. Whistleblower reassigned to civilian sector. Case archived under agricultural subsidy classification. Henning's eyes widened as he read over Eli's shoulder. This isn't possible. These files were destroyed. Looks like someone kept a copy, Eli said quietly. The room fell silent except for the faint hum of the laptop. Outside, a truck passed on the distant road, the sound fading into the wind. Henning exhaled, rubbing his forehead. "You don't know what this means," he muttered. "It means my grandfather wasn't the thief." Eli said he was trying to expose one. Henning looked up, his expression torn between disbelief and fear. If that's true, then the people funding the cleanup operations, they're still active. And if they know you have this— His words trailed off as the lights flickered a low drone humming outside the window. Duke's ears shot up a growl, rumbling deep in his chest. Eli glanced toward the glass. Through the trees, a faint red light pulsed, moving slowly across the field, scanning. Another drone, larger this time, hovered near the orchard, circling above the well. The laptop screen glowed in the half-dark, casting pale light over the room. Rain tapped against the windows again, but Eli barely heard it. His eyes were fixed on the words before him, each line rewriting everything he thought he knew about his grandfather and himself. Agent Henning leaned closer, the reflection of classified seals flickering across his glasses. The files were long and technical, buried under government language designed to obscure meaning, but as Eli scrolled through, a narrative took shape, one that carried the weight of a man's entire life. Operation Harvest, it turned out, wasn't a laundering scheme. It was a secret compensation initiative launched after the Korean War, created by a small group of officers who wanted to ensure the wounded and the families of the dead received what bureaucracy had denied them. One file noted that Lieutenant Frank D. Weller was last assigned to transport ledgers to Site 7A. His status changed to MIA within a mile of the Turner property. Officially, it didn't exist. Unofficially, it had grown into a network of quiet repayments, all funneled through agricultural subsidies and supply chains like Garrity Logistics. "My grandfather wasn't hiding stolen money," Eli murmured. "He was hiding charity." Henning nodded slowly. "A fund outside the law. Noble, but dangerous. If the government had found it, they'd have called it treason." He rubbed his temple. "Your grandfather must have known that's why the records had to disappear." Eli clicked into the final folder labeled Personal Directive, GT. The screen filled with a scanned page, his grandfather's handwriting unmistakable. "If this reaches you, it means I failed to protect the last of Harvest. This money is not mine, not stolen, not clean, but it is owed. I could not spend it without betraying those who bled for it. One day, someone will need it for the right reasons. Keep the farm, keep the dog. They'll lead you when I no longer can." Eli's chest tightened. He could hear his grandfather's gravelly voice in every word. For the first time since returning to this land, the weight in his chest wasn't just grief, it was understanding. The silence, the secrecy, the buried well, it had all been protection. He looked over at Duke, lying near the doorway, his eyes calm, and knowing the same eyes that had watched generations of Turners carry their burdens. "He really meant it," Eli whispered. "He left it for me to finish." Henning's gaze softened. "There's more," he said quietly. He pulled up a final encrypted attachment, trust account details. Inside were notarized documents verifying the Swiss coordinates. At the bottom of the file, a clause read disbursement contingent on direct air verification, bloodline, and honorable military service record required. The trust wasn't locked forever. It was waiting. "It's not just a story," Henning said. "The money's real, still held under a neutral custodian. Whoever can prove relation to Grant Turner and a service record in good standing, well, that would meet the conditions." Eli stared at the clause, his pulse thudding in his ears. "That's me," he said quietly. Henning nodded. "Looks that way. You're the only one left." For a long time, neither spoke. Outside, the clouds began to break, a thin light bleeding through the edges of gray. The air in the farmhouse felt lighter, but heavier too, as though the walls themselves were exhaling after decades of keeping a secret. Eli stood walking to the window. The orchard stretched out before him, quiet and scarred, yet somehow alive. The money, $250 million, wasn't fortune, it was legacy. A fund meant to mend what war had broken. His grandfather hadn't buried gold. He'd buried purpose. If I claim it, Eli said, his voice steady but low, they'll come for me. Garrity, the investors. Anyone who profited from keeping this buried. Probably, Henning admitted. But if you don't, it dies with you. The money vanishes into paper, and what they built will be erased. Eli looked down at Duke, who had come to sit beside him. The dog's head brushed his knee, eyes bright in the thin light. He trusted me, Eli murmured, and I almost sold it. Henning closed the laptop. Then don't make the same mistake twice. The words lingered. Eli nodded, though his jaw was tight. His phone lit with a new message from an unlisted number, a revised offer that doubled the cash and promised anonymity. He stared until the screen dimmed and went black. He felt the shift inside him, the slow, reluctant awakening of the soldier he had tried to bury with his past. Not the man who came home broken, but the one who once believed in service and duty and something greater than himself. He turned to the ledger on the table, ran his hand over the worn cover. He called it Harvest, Eli said. Maybe it was never about crops. Maybe it was about what grows after war. Outside, the rain had stopped entirely. The world was damp and clean, the kind of silence that comes only after truth has been spoken aloud. Henning gathered his papers, glancing toward the horizon. You know what happens next, right? Eli nodded slowly. Yeah, he said. Now I decide what kind of man I want to be. Duke barked once low and certain, as if he already knew the answer. The first morning of autumn broke with a kind of stillness that didn't feel empty, it felt earned. The air smelled of hay and clean soil. The sky stretched wide over fields that, for the first time in years, glowed orange again. Rows of pumpkins spread across the land, their color rich and full, not because they promised profit, but because they meant something had survived. Eli Turner stood at the gate, a hand resting on the old wooden post that had once leaned with age and now stood straight again. The sign above it read, Pumpkin Fields Foundation, for those who served, for those who fell, for those who rise again. The letters shimmered faintly in the early light, carved into bronze, and set against the same timber his grandfather had once nailed with his bare hands. Reporters were setting up near the barn, local news crews waiting to film the ceremony. Trucks filled with volunteers and veterans rolled in their laughter, carried by the wind. The farmhouse, once gray and broken, had been restored not to its former state, but into something new. The main hall now held offices and therapy rooms. The barn had been turned into a workshop. The orchard beyond it had become a place for quiet walks and long talks. And at the center of it all, the old well remained sealed not as a wound, but as a monument. A plaque sat over it reading, Let the harvest feed the forgotten. Those were his grandfather's words, lifted from the last page of the ledger. Eli had made them the foundation's motto. He didn't take a cent for himself. The Swiss trust had been reactivated and fully transferred into the foundation's accounts, every transaction public, every record open. A consent letter from the Department of Defense Inspector General acknowledged Operation Harvest as an extra statutory restitution pool and waived further enforcement, provided full restitution and transparency. A district court order approved air verification, recognized the trust conditions, and placed the foundation under independent board governance with annual audits by a Big Four firm. Operation Harvest had returned to the light strip of secrecy, turned into something pure. Henning had helped him through the paperwork, his once cautious tone softening over time. You did what he wanted, the agent had said before leaving for Washington. Not many people would have done the same. He did the hard part, Eli had replied. I just brought it home, and now home had a new meaning. Duke stood beside him, his coat faded but still proud, his muzzle almost white. The years had slowed him, but not dulled him. The dog's eyes still carried that quiet watchfulness, the kind that saw beyond the surface of things. Children from nearby farms played near the fence, tossing a ball that Duke followed with half a wag and a full heart. When the crowd began to gather, Eli stepped onto the small wooden platform near the gate. His voice carried through the microphone, steady but warm. "This land once held secrets," he said, scanning the faces of veterans, families, neighbors. "Now it holds hope. What started as a buried mistake ended as a promise kept. My grandfather believed that even after war, something could grow again. And maybe that's what harvest really means." The audience was quiet for a long moment, then the applause came soft at first, then swelling like the sound of wind through the trees. Eli stepped down, shaking hands, hugging old soldiers he had once served beside. A group of farmers thanked him for saving their mortgages. A young Marine told him he had found work through the program. Eli just knotted his throat too tight for words. When the crowd thinned, he walked toward the gate where Duke had taken up his usual post. The dog stood still, ears perked, watching the road where the horizon met the hills. The sun was setting now, painting the fields in gold. Eli crouched beside him, resting a hand on his back. "We did it, old boy," he said softly. "It's finally done." Duke looked up, tail thumping once against the dirt. Eli smiled, scratching behind his ear when his fingers brushed something cold. He leaned closer and saw a small metal tag on the inside of Duke's collar, worn smooth with time. He turned it gently, the engraving faint but legible, Operation Harvest Guardian. Eli froze, the realization settling slow and deep. His grandfather had given Duke this collar long before Eli ever returned, long before the truth had surfaced. Somehow, the dog had carried the legacy all along. He laughed quietly, the sound breaking somewhere between joy and ache. "You really were watching over it, huh?" Duke blinked up at him, calm, content, as if to say the mission was complete. Behind them, laughter rose from the courtyard, the sound of children and veterans mingling, of life beginning again. The smell of pumpkin pie drifted from the kitchen, mixed with the earthy scent of rain-soaked ground. Eli straightened hand, still resting on Duke's back, and looked over the land. The sun caught on the new plaques on the bronze sign on the distant flag waving gently above the barn. Everything that had once been broken was part of something whole now. He took a deep breath and exhaled slowly. "Harvest?" he whispered. "Guess it never really ended." Duke stayed at his side, steady and silent, his gaze fixed on the road as if waiting for one more traveler to come home. The wind brushed through the fields, carrying the faint rustle of leaves and a whisper that sounded almost like a promise, the kind that lingers long after the story ends. If this story moved, you take a second to like and subscribe. It helps more people find stories like this one. Tell me in the comments which moment struck you the most, when Eli uncovered the truth about his grandfather, or when Duke stood guard one last time. And where are you watching from tonight?